Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Black Life as Subject Matter 2. This exhibition is produced and circulated by Ebony Gallery in Dayton, Ohio. And today we're thrilled to present artist Larry Winston Collins. But first, there's just a little bit of housekeeping to go over. Everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize the chat function in your control panel to ask questions. We'll monitor your questions throughout the presentation and be sure to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. Next, live captioning is available for this artist talk, and you can access those by clicking on the closed caption icon and selecting Show Subtitle. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thank you in advance for bearing with us. I promise we'll keep rolling through any technical difficulties. And lastly, to get everyone comfortable, go ahead and click on the chat function in your control panel to say hello and let us know where you're tuning in from. Okay, thanks all for joining us. And now to you, Larry.
All right. First of all, I'd like to thank the Rife Gallery for inviting me to do this artist talk. I've got a chance to see the exhibition, and it's a wonderful exhibition. If you haven't had a chance to go see it, I would advise you to go to the Rife Gallery and check out the exhibition. All right, so I'm going to do this artist talk, and I'm going to talk a little bit about myself as an artist and talk about my history a little bit, share a little bit about my background, and then show some of my artwork and talk a little bit about my different art mediums that I work in, art styles. Originally I wanted to call this artist talk art fusion because I tend to work in a lot of different mediums. I work with paints, and I do drawings, and I do collage, and I sort of combine all of those things, sculpture. And so, I was a big fan of the art movement called jazz fusion. And with that jazz fusion, they were actually combining a lot of different art forms together, music forms. So, rock and jazz and some classical with Chick Corea and stuff. And so, groups like To Return to Forever and, Billy Cobham and Weather Report. So I thought that my artwork kind of favors that also, where I combine a lot of things like they were doing back then. So I thought a good way to explain my work is to call it art fusion. So let's go on, and I'll share a little bit of background here. All right, so first of all, I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I graduated from Columbus College of Art and Design, and from my graduation, I worked as a book designer for Merrill Publishing Company in Columbus, Ohio, and worked there for a number of years. And then I decided to quit my job at Merrill Publishing Company and pursue a career as a fine artist. So I actually got a studio at the Columbus King's Arts Center, down the King Arts Complex down in Columbus, Ohio. Got one of the studios there, was there with Amina and Kojo. And so I was one of the first artists that had a studio there. And I did that for a number of years, about 2 years. And then I decided to go get my master's degree. And I went to Baltimore at the Maryland Institute College of Art and got my master's degree. And then I returned back to Columbus, and I started to work as a professor. I didn't start off as a professor, but I started to work as a professor at the Columbus College of Art and Design. By the time I left there, I was an associate professor. But I left there to take a job as a professor at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And so I was there for about 16 years, 15, 16 years. And I just retired last year. So I'm officially a retired professor. All right, so that's some of my background. I talked about I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. So my neighborhood that I grew up in was called Corryville. Well, it's called Corryville. And if you're not familiar where Corryville is, it's right next to the University of Cincinnati. And University Hospital is right on the other side. So they sort of surround Corryville. It's a small community, but it's where I grew up and went to church and everything else in this community. All right, speaking of churches, that's the church I went to over on the left-hand side. You can see this is the street I grew up on, Fosdick Street, and you can see a picture of my house that I grew up in. It was 5 kids, mother and father and 5 kids. We all grew up in that house. I was the middle kid, had an older brother, older sister, younger brother, and younger sister. So I was right in the middle. And so that's where I grew up. I graduated from Hughes High School, which is right next to University of Cincinnati. And that's a picture of Hughes, and that's a picture of my high school art teacher. His name was LeRoy Porter, or is LeRoy Porter. And he's a very talented artist in himself. You can see some of his works there. And, you know, he was the person who saw some potential in my abilities as an artist and sort of helped me put together a portfolio. And I submitted it to Columbus College of Art and Design and got a scholarship to go to Columbus College of Art and Design. So I always give Mr. Porter, I still call him Mr. Porter to this day. I still give him my props for just getting me the start to become an artist. Some of the people that were some of my influences were artists Charles White. And if you're not familiar with Charles White's works, I would say, you know, look him up on Wikipedia or, you know, internet, and you can see a number of his different works. There's a number of different books about Charles White, incredible artist. I was really affected by his drawings, you know, his drawing skill. And so he was a major influence. Another influence was an artist named John Biggers. And you can see some of his artwork. He did a lot of murals. Just another incredible artist. Was really, really inspired by his drawings and his paintings. And so, yeah, so it was a great joy to see some other African-American artists, some Black artists actually doing some great things. You know, I guess growing up, I didn't see a lot of Black artists. And so just getting the chance to see that there are some successful Black artists out there was a great inspiration for me. So, so they were a great talent for me to look forward to discovering. And also an artist named Elisabeth Catlett. And you can see some of her works. Elisabeth Catlett was just amazing. I mean, she did drawings, prints, and just an amazing sculptor. You know, you can see some of her sculptures over behind her portrait there, but if you get a chance, take a look at some of her work. All right, so those are some of my influences. During my years in college, I would go home to Cincinnati from Columbus, and I would work with a man named Gilbert Young, an artist, and he ran a program called Metro Murals. And Metro Murals did a lot of mural projects in Cincinnati. Actually, it was Gilbert and his wife, Joyce Young, that actually sort of ran the program. But I started working with them during the summers. And this is one of the actual murals that we worked on, was on William Howard Taft. It was there for a number of years. And then I think they finally did paint over it and put another mural there. It was called the Wall of Education. So, and we did different panels and things there. And I don't know if you can see it, but that's me standing in the middle there with a giant afro. So I had a little bit more hair back then. All right, this is one of my drawings that I did when I first started out pursuing a career as a fine artist. When I started working at that publishing company doing book designs, I was so conditioned to work as on artist in the art school. And you know, if anybody knows anything about Columbus College of Art and Design, you're constantly working, you know, morning, noon, and night, you know. So when I got out and actually started working a full-time job, I would go home and I actually felt guilty about just sitting around doing nothing. And so I actually started just doing work, you know, started working on drawings and things in my spare time. And over a period of time, I started to accumulate a lot of different drawings and things. And then I started thinking about doing some exhibitions and things. But this was one of the drawings that I did during that time that I was, you know, starting to discover how to produce a body of work. So this was called Peaches and Cream. This was a little girl that was the daughter of a co-worker there at the publishing company. All right, this is a drawing, another pencil drawing. I worked a lot with ebony pencils, and this is a drawing of my father, Davy Lee. And I took a photograph of him as he was falling asleep one evening when he came home from work. He looked like he's reading the Sunday paper. So, I mean, he worked a lot. So you can see that he's sitting there reading the paper. But and this is a pretty large drawing. And it's in the style of sort of Charles White and John Biggers. This is another pencil drawing. This is my grandfather. We called him Daddy Bill, and he was in Bruton, Alabama, not that far from Pensacola, Florida, what James Brown would call LA, which was Lower Alabama. And so this is my grandfather, and doing one of his famous pastimes of sitting on the porch and swatting flies. But he was a great fisherman, hunter, and you know, he and my grandmother had a nice little house down there in Florida. Let me see, how do I go back? All right, here's a drawing that I did from a photograph that I had. It's called the Nomad. And again, very large drawing. I really got into doing the details of the cloth and things with this. So just sort of like in the style of some of the artists that I sort of admired. This was another painting that I did. And this was a painting from a trip that I took to Africa, to Senegal, to Dakar, Senegal. And so it was one of my oil paintings. This was another oil painting from that trip. All right, so when I graduated from CCAD, there was a gallery that was right across the street from Columbus College of Art and Design, right there on Washington. And this gentleman here, Kojo, he opened up this gallery. He was a photographer, but he opened up this gallery and he called it ACE Gallery. Now, ACE stands for Arts for Community Expression. And so me and a friend walked over to the gallery one day, was looking around, and Kojo was showing us different things in the gallery. And so he invited us to become members of ACE. And so we became members, and you know, ACE did a lot of different activities in the community. They did exhibitions. They did a thing called an Afro Fair. And so Kojo and his wife, Marianne, actually started ACE Gallery, ACE. And so it's a picture of Kojo, it's a photographer. All right, these are some of the artists that were in the ACE organization. And you can see me in the background. I'm the tallest one in the back. And you can see like Roman Johnson is Amina. You can see Smokey, Barbara Chavis, Queen Brooks. What's kind of funny about this picture is that when we took the picture, there were some key members that wasn't there. And so Kojo which you can see Kojo in the back, over to the right. He had just learned how to do Photoshop. So he said, well, they're not here, so I could just Photoshop them in. And so you can see Ed Colston, and you can see Fioria's West sort of Photoshopped in the background back here. And they're almost as tall as I am, but you know, so it was kind of funny. It was sort of a running joke about as far as them being in this photograph. This is me at the Afro Fair. We used to have a summer's fair at the Mount Vernon Plaza over on the west side of, I shouldn't say west side, yeah, west. But yeah, I guess it would be west side. But this is my booth. You can see some of my different works there. You can see the drawing of my father there. You can see sort of the scale of that drawing. Some other drawings that I did. But this was a great event. There used to be a lot of different artists showing their works there, and music and dance and poetry and all of that during that time. ACE sponsored an artist to go to Africa every 2 years. Amina Robinson was the first that they sponsored, and then Charles Miller was the second, and I was the third artist that they sponsored to actually go to Africa. So from my trip to Africa, I started doing works that were related to my African experience. And when I was there, I had a chance to go to an island called LeRoy Island. And that was the island where a lot of the slaves were housed before actually taking the trip to America on the Middle Passage. And so from that experience, I actually started doing a number of works. And at first, what I was trying to do was sort of create works that were similar to some of the wood carvings that I actually saw there. But I didn't have the patience to do wood carving. So I started trying to discover different ways to actually sort of get that same type of effect. So I started using cutout pieces and pasting them onto the surface and covering those with plaster and things. And it sort of created this style, a relief style of all these different mediums. You can actually see some drawings on the picture on the right. This was a picture called Bloodline, and those were different persons that I met there when I was in Africa. The bottom section of this was done by a process called coleographs. And it's a process where you make a plate. It's a printmaking process. You make a plate, you build up the surface, and then you take the plate, you ink the plate, wipe the plate, put a sheet of wet paper over top of it and run it through the press. And you sort of get this embossed print, which was a really nice print. But I like the prints a lot, but I really like the plates more than I actually like the prints. And so I started thinking, again, about, combining some things. And so I thought that what would happen if I actually started making some actual pictures like the plates, just make giant plates, but instead of printing them, just use those as the actual paintings. This is a picture of me and my art studio at the King Arts Complex. And you can see I'm working on a picture called King's Life. This is a picture of that. This picture is actually at the Frank Hale Cultural Center down at Ohio State. It was one of the first pictures in the collection there. I think it might have been the first picture. Larry Williamson is the person in charge, and he always tells me that, yeah, you actually started the collections here. So, and you can actually see that picture if you go there to the Frank Hale Culture Center. Course about Dr. Martin Luther King's got a collage of different things related to his life and his experience. This was a picture, another picture, which I call a mixed media relief picture, and or should I say relief painting. And this picture, is taken from a photograph. I'll talk a little bit more about my photographs, but I started taking a lot of photographs to use as reference for my paintings and my drawings and things. And this was taken from a photograph of two little girls that lived on my street there in Corryville. That's Vicky and Deetra. But they were running buddies, and you can see, I actually put an actual jump rope and this actual jacks and the actual dress. So it's got a really high texture of a lot of different plaster things going on in the surface. Another picture of that same type of medium. I did a whole exhibition called Imagery Black and White. And actually I did it at the Rife Gallery. And this was, wow, I can't tell you what year it was, but it was a year back, and I did all these different pictures that was related to different subject matters, but all that were black and white with built up surface. This is a picture of my younger brother, and I'm also a percussionist. So I play things like drums and bongos, timbales, and he's sitting there with one of my drums. And this picture was actually bought by the guy who actually created the Cabbage Patch doll, Xavier Roberts. And so I was down in Atlanta in an arts fair, and he came along and he saw it and he bought it. So I always tell people that this picture is in the Cabbage Patch collection. This is another picture. This picture is called Sister Sarah. And this picture had a strange story. I created this again from a photograph that I took of a woman who was sitting on a front porch during a funeral that I went to in not Florida, but Alabama. And I actually changed her features a little bit. I took her glasses. She had glasses on, took her glasses off, kind of changed her structure a little bit. And then I was in that show, and my aunts and uncles and my mother and father came down to see the show. And I was trying to figure out a name for this picture, and I was going to call it Sister Rose. But a friend of mine who had a studio at the King Arts Complex, Gilda Edwards, she came to my studio and she said, I told her what the name was. And she said, well, she looks more like a Sister Sarah to me. And so I said, oh, maybe so. So I changed the name to Sister Sarah. So when my mother and father and my aunts and uncles came to see the show, they were walking around, and when they saw this picture, they said, wow, where did you get a picture of your great aunt Sarah? And I had never met her, but they said that it looked just like her. And so it was kind of strange that, I ended up naming her that, and that's who she actually was. All right, here's another picture that I did from that show, Imagery Black and White. And this picture was called Endangered Species. I was watching the news, and they were showing a sort of news story about how the jails were overcrowded. And when they were showing the jail cells and everything, what I noticed about, Jim just panning around looking at all the different prisoners, that I noticed that there were a lot of Black men in the prison cells. And so I just started thinking about what's going on with, a lot of Black males being incarcerated these days. So I created this picture called Endangered Species. And this picture was actually bought again down in Atlanta by this gentleman here, Reverend C.T. Vivian. And he just passed away last a couple of years ago, 2020. But he was a great civil rights leader. He actually was the lieutenant for Dr. Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement, and marched with Dr. King and everything. And you can kind of see the picture in the background. A lot of his photographs he took with the pictures. So I'm thinking that he really enjoyed having the picture in his collection. Okay, so when I went to graduate school, and I talked about I went to graduate school at Maryland Institute College of Art. When I got there, I started doing paintings. I started working with the relief paintings, but then I decided to change it up a bit and start working with wood and doing some sculptures and things, just to try to, again, kind of just advance my knowledge of materials and just try to experiment with some different types of mediums and things. And so I started doing some sculptures, and you can kind of see my studio there in Maryland. Let's see, go back here. And so some of the things I started working with is the African mask. And I started creating these mask series. And this one's called the Pepsi mask. And I started using like a lot of found materials like bean cans and soup cans and things, and started using pop cans and things and just creating these sculptures, whatever found materials I could find. That was Pepsi mask, and this is Coke mask. Also, I started just creating sculptures, just thinking about different forms and things. So I did a whole series called the Ring series. And these are some examples of that series. This first one, it was using, cans and things to kind of get a sort of a textural surface. And this one's using more like soda pop cans and things like that to get some nice textural things using type and color. All right, so when I was in graduate school in Baltimore, I had an apartment. My first year there, I had an apartment on the outskirts of Baltimore, and I would have to drive into Baltimore to go to school every day. Now, an unfortunate thing happened. My car broke down. And so that meant that I had to catch the bus to school every day. And so on my journey to school, which was, close to the downtown area of Baltimore, I started noticing a lot of different things. Actually, when you're driving, you don't actually see a lot when you're driving, but if you're actually walking and you're, actually experiencing the life that's, brought to you from the city, then you get a chance to actually experience a lot more. So from that unfortunate thing of my car breaking down, I started to notice a lot of things. Like I started to notice a lot of homeless people that were out on the streets in Baltimore. And so what I started doing was I started taking my sketchbook and started sketching a lot of the people that I would see on my journey to school each and every day. And so I started doing these sculptures based off of my sketches, and I called them homeless positions. And so this was one of the first ones I did. And on the surface of this one, I sort of created sort of a surface similar to some of my paintings that I had done in the past, sort of collaging a lot of different images and just building up the surface with a lot of different patterns and textures and things. So this was called actually homeless position number 1. And you can actually see a little bit more detail of that. I should say that that person I actually saw on the streets of Baltimore sleeping on, it was like during the dead mist of winter, but they were sleeping on a heat vent, like in the middle of a street. There was a little island in the middle of the street and there was a heat vent. And a lot of the homeless people would hang out there because there would be actually heat coming from the vents. And so that was one of the persons that I would see, on my journeys traveling to my school. This was a person that I saw in New York. I would take trips up to New York, and this person was actually sitting on the street with a cup in front of him, similar to that cup that you see there. And he was sitting on some newspaper. And so I decided that I should cover the surface with newspaper but I covered the surface with housing ads and want ads and things like that, job ads and things like that. So this was homeless position number 2. This was homeless position number 3. And with this one, you can sort of see that I used a lot of found wood. What I started doing was I started using a lot of wood materials and things that I would find. There was a building site that was right next to my studio, and they had a big dumpster where they were discarding a lot of wood and things. So I would actually dumpster dive and get some wood out and actually create some sculptures from that actual material. And this was called homeless position number 3. This was another homeless position number 4. And this was a series of sculptures that I did. And these are probably about 7 feet tall. And this was from a place that I would walk past after I would get off the bus. I would walk to the school, and there was a place where they were giving out free meals and clothing and stuff to a lot of the people that were on the streets of Baltimore. And so I kind of created this piece, just kind of based off of some of the people that I would actually pass in that line outside of this building. The next one is another homeless position. And I decided to do this one in just cans, like bean cans and soup cans and things. One of the interesting things about a lot of these homeless positions that have cans and things on them, whenever I did an exhibition, people would always put money in the can, during the exhibition. So by the end of the exhibition, I would actually have money that people would actually put, in change or whatever. And so I guess it was effective in a lot of ways. And this piece is actually at the King Arts Complex now. All right, so you can sort of see some examples of some of the sculptures that I was working with back then, different shapes and things. Okay, I'm gonna move a little faster here. This is a playground that I actually created a piece for it that's on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. It's called the Kwanzaa Playground. And it's right there on Brighton Road. It used to be called English Park, but we changed the name to the Kwanzaa Playground. These are some of the artists that did different pieces that are located. Not all the pieces are still there. Some of the pieces have actually decayed and had to be taken away. Actually, my piece is gone now too. It was there for, wow, almost 20 years, I guess, but now it's actually gone. But these are some of the artists and some of the people who actually worked on that project. This is the piece that I actually created. It's called the African Tele-Story Board. And each one of these blocks is kind of similar to the tic-tac-toes that you actually see in some of the parks now for kids. But in this case, each one of these blocks had different illustrations on them. And what children would do is they would turn the block to a different illustration, and then they would have to make up a story to go with the illustrations. So they would have to use their imagination to actually create, they would say something like it was started on a sunny day and there was a boat in the ocean in Africa and so on and so on. So a pretty good way to get children to use their imagination. Again, so this is another thing that I would actually work with. I did a lot of different things like collages. So these are some of the collages that I did. And for these, what I would do is I would get a sheet of white paper and just roll some ink and paper and paint and things on the paper. And then I would actually take that paper and cut it up and use it to create the collages. And I'm still doing this now. These are always kind of fun. These are kind of like therapy for me. And what's kind of great about these is, it's almost like a a musician sort of makes a song, I usually start off with the background, like a backbeat first, and then I would sort of take that and I would add the melody to it and the accents and all that stuff. So I sort of make them up as I go. And then after it's over, just like someone, like a musician would say, all right, so what are we gonna call this? So I look at it and say, well, this looks like so and so and so, you know? So it kind of happens just like that. And it's kind of fun to actually kind of create these collages like that. These are also collages, but these are a little bit more detailed where I actually would use a lot of found materials and things. You can see a branch in there and some actual wire sort of fencing in it, things like that, some photographs at the top. This is an interesting piece. This is called Aftermath. And it's actually dealing with, back then we were dealing with, well, actually, this, come to think of it, I did this after I had a fellowship in Dresden, Germany. And when I was there, they had a lot of photographs of the bombing of Dresden during World War II. And so I did this piece sort of, you know, thinking about that experience. And that was a picture actually Dresden when it was actually sort of firebombed during World War II. And so, but what's interesting about this is you see these images now and it kind of reminds you of images of the Ukraine that's actually going on this right now. This is another image of a picture that is a mixed media relief picture. And I started doing a number of pictures like this where I was just dealing with a lot of shapes and forms and things, some of them related to my African influences and things. This, actually, I called this piece Hopscotch. For some reason, it just has sort of a fun kind of sensibility to it. So I decided to call it Hopscotch. I started doing some linoleum block prints. And this sort of all came from an experience I had with my older sister. When I went to her house, she was watching a movie that had a famous actor in it. And when her son came downstairs, he asked what we were looking at. And my sister said, we're looking at a cowboy movie with Sidney Poitier. And that's her son said, she looked at us and said, well, who's Sidney Poitier? And I was like, wow, you know, I mean, and he was a teenager. And I was like, wow, he doesn't even know who Sidney Poitier is. And so I started doing this whole series just, you know, I'm a teacher, so, you know, I'm always thinking about how can I help to educate, you know, the youth and things. So I started doing these pictures of famous African Americans, just so people will have a sense of who these people were. So these are some of the actual people in the series. There was actually almost 83 of these in all. So these are some of those ones. This is Billie Holiday and Thelonious Monk. I did a jazz series and I did a soul series and I did actors, poets, sports, you know, I covered a lot of different people. There's John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley. Mary Lou Williams, who a lot of people don't know too much about, who was an incredible pianist and jazz singer and things. Count Basie. I guess all of these are from the jazz. I didn't think about that. Oh, and then Sidney Poitier, of course, and Gregory Hines. And these are small. These are only about 6 by 6 inches. Another thing, you know, always sort of learning as I go along, I started doing these things called rub prints. And this came about from me actually looking at some of my linoleum block prints, plates, and I started wondering, well, what would happen if I put a sheet of paper over the top of it and got a crayon and sort of rubbed across the top. And so I did that and it kind of picked up all the top surfaces. And so then I sort of developing more and more and thinking about adding layers and layers and things. And so I kind of created this whole style of print making called rub prints. And these are two of those different prints from that experience. I did this series called All for the Cause, and these were pictures that I used a lot of different found materials, old frames and cans, like pop cans and bean cans and things. But these were all portraits of people who died during the civil rights movement. And I think it's like 33 of these. This series was actually bought by the Ohio State University, and it's at the Frank Hale Culture Center. So these are some of those from that. And they're not real big, probably about 20 inches by, 20 by 20 inches. But you can see some of the different people. And of course, we had Dr. Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers, the 4 young girls who were killed in the church bombing. So it's, it's like 33 different figures that's in this series. I started doing this series, excuse me, called Legacy. And so with these, they're a little bit larger linoleum block prints. And so I did a whole male series, and my intention was to do a female series. And I still am planning to do it, but I just haven't gotten around to doing that series yet. But this is one of the ones in the first portfolio. It's Muhammad Ali. Actually, that's a young Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. That's a Malcolm X. All right, so I did this project with Kojo. You can see Kojo over on the right-hand side. We did this project in Columbus called the Cultural Wall, the Long Street Cultural Wall. And I worked with Kojo on this project. I did the actual prints that are on the wall, and Kojo, being a photographer, we used all of his photographs for the wall. This is a picture of that cultural wall right there. The wall actually extends over 71. That's on Long Street. So you can actually go down and see it if you're there in Columbus. This is sort of a close-up of the wall. You see my wife over there on the right-hand side. So the close-up. So these were all done as linoleum block prints first, and then we enlarged them to put them on the wall. This was an exhibition that I just had last year at the Shot Tower Gallery at Fort Hays High School. One of the most beautiful galleries there in Columbus, along with the Rife Gallery, of course. But, great space. And I did this series called They That Matter. And these were all portraits of men and women who were killed by extreme police violence. So, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. So, and I think there's probably about 24, 25 of these portraits that's in this exhibition. These are some of those. These were some that were sort of a lower relief, and these are actually in frames. And you can actually see some of the texture on things, but there were 10 of these in this style. And those were actual paintings that I did in the middle, done with acrylic paints. You can see Jordan Edwards and Anthony Hill. And then these were some of the ones that I did, sort of similar to the All for the Cause series that I did with the civil rights people. But I wanted to do something similar to that, but on a larger scale. So I actually started using different things, like found objects and things that I found at the thrift store. I like going to thrift stores and rummaging around for things. So And the portraits are actually done in acrylic paints. Now, if you saw the actual portraits, the portraits are actually a relief surface, and they're actually drawn in plaster. I would get a sheet of wood, put some plaster on it, and then look at the portrait and draw the portrait before the actual plaster would actually dry. And then I would go and I would actually paint the portrait. So if you see the actual portrait, the portraits actually look like they're ceramic or porcelain. And I wanted them to look like they were a little bit more precious than just paint on a canvas. So you can actually see how the lines are created by me drawing into the wet plaster. So these are two more from that series. This is the largest one. This is the Trayvon Martin. And you can kind of see the scale of that one. This is a piece that I did as a dedication to someone at the Miami Art Museum. So Bob Wicks, who was retiring as the director, and they wanted to give him something for his retirement. And he really admired John Lewis. So I created this piece and I gave it to him during his retirement party. And so, you know, you can see John Lewis and you can see different sort of vignettes of things that were pinnacle periods of John Lewis's life. And he always said, you know, one of his mottos was get in good trouble. This is a series I did called the Pandemic Series. And this was done during our whole period of being stuck in the house during the whole 2 years of the pandemic. And so these were rub drawings. And you can see that, you know, I have different layers. Whenever you see the round sort of objects in there, that's sort of the virus. And I did 4 of this prints in this series. The first one was called the virus. The second one was the spread. You can kind of see it spreading from one person to the other. And then the third one is the isolation, you know, being confined to your own space and your own house and not supposed to actually be next to, you know, being 6 feet apart from each person. And then you can see an isolation sort of, you know, you will watch the news and they will always tell you about how many people were dying from this actual virus. And then the fourth one is the cure. And so you can see that the infection sort of went from this sort of organic shape to more of a graphic shape. So you can kind of see that people are actually being cured from this vaccine that was created. And I don't know if you can see it, but on the top, those are actual needles. Like you can see the vaccine inside of the needles. All right, almost coming to the end. This is something that I've done within the last, you know, 4 or 5 years. I started going back and looking at a lot of the photographs that I took as reference for a lot of my paintings and drawings and things. And as I was looking through a lot of my photographs, I started noticing like, wow, that's actually not a bad photograph. So I should actually start exhibiting these as photographs. And I actually created a book, 2 of these photographs. And so these are some of my photographs that I've done recently. And still working with this. I'm actually still taking photographs. Photography has always been sort of a passion of mine. And I used to get on my bicycle and strap my camera around my back and ride around and take photographs, you know, back when I was a little bit younger. But I'm still taking photographs these days, and I actually enjoy just exhibiting my photographs from time to time. So that's the last one, and this last slide. So if you want some more information on me, You can visit my website. It's larrywcollins.com, or even if you just put in Larry Winston Collins, on a lot of different things will come up. Some things on YouTube and some other things, some articles and things. And if you want to see a copy of my photography book, it's called Captured Moments. You can go to blurb.com, and if you put in Larry W. Collins, then my photography book will actually come up. And that's the last.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing, and then you and I can chat about your work.
Okay.
So I am going to spotlight. And so something that we had chatted about when we first talked about your work, and you doing an artist talk, something I've always admired about your work, is your frugality. Like you don't let anything stand in the way of making work. You use the things that are around you. Can you talk a little bit more about, as an educator, how you impress upon students the availability and how you can not only find influence, but material all around you? Could you chat a little about that?
Sure. You know, when I was at Columbus College of Art and Design and also at Miami University, I taught a lot of the foundation classes. So I taught, you know, like design compositions, and I taught two-dimensional design, three-dimensional design. So we were always working with a lot of different materials, you know, in those classes. And so I would always kind of stress about, you know, finding how to get the most out of those materials, how to manipulate those materials to get the best results. And then, you know, there were certain projects where the students were required to actually go out and find things and actually create sculptures or create a collage or things like that. And, you know, so it was always an experience of discovery, you know, in a lot of those classes, which I enjoyed a lot because that's exactly the way that I work.
So we have a question that I'm going to kind of parse together. There's a curiosity about how you work and whether it's improvisational or sketched out, or maybe a combination inspired by materials that you found. Can you give a little peek into the process of making your work, from inspiration or sketch, or how that works for you?
Yeah, I sort of work both ways, you know. In some cases, you know, I might sketch it out first, or at least come up with something as a sort of a guideline for the motivation of the piece. You know, it might be something that's sort of just an expressive concept of the structure or the composition, and then I'll start with that. They're never really, my lot of sketches are never really detailed. They're more or less just sort of in a sense of the concept. And then from that, then I sort of take that and I sort of build onto that. Some things are totally spontaneous, like I talked about some of the collages where I actually just get the paper and just start cutting up the paper. I do have sort of a graphics background, you know, working in the publishing company and stuff. And I took a lot of graphic design and drafting classes when I was in high school, and also, you know, some things in college. I actually majored in industrial design when I was in Columbus College of Art and Design. And so I have that sort of structured type of sort of, you know, essence in my sort of way of thinking. And so a lot of times they're all sort of straight lines, straightforward type of ways of dividing the space. But then from that, you know, once I have that, then I started putting a lot of more organic things and stuff inside of that structure. So it's almost like I almost have to kind of create a base structure first, and then from that I can actually get creative with coming up with some spontaneous things.
So essentially creating the walls which you will push against, right? Like the framework to push against.
Exactly.
So both in the more two-dimensional and the three-dimensional, but it doesn't matter which one. Both you dive in similarly and can play back and forth, which also, I mean, it speaks exactly to what you talked about earlier and how you see yourself right alongside the jazz fusion artists. Like that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So something else I would love for you to chat a bit about, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I recall you did an artist talk a long time ago that I listened to, and you talked about the importance of community and inspiration around you. Can you chat a little bit about what that means to you, how you operate in that, and make sure that you have that as a resource, and perhaps how that ties into being a part of this group of phenomenal artists in this exhibition?
Yeah, well, a lot of the pieces that I showed you were a reflection of a lot of things that were going on around me, so, things that I actually experienced in my community, or if I saw something that sort of affected me in the news or something, that series that I created based on the civil rights movement in the portraits were from a book that I actually found that was talking about the civil rights monument that was actually created. And so they were showing all the different figures. And so something, something like that. Like I am a child of the civil rights movement. And, and so, I was actually born the same year that, and just tell you how old I am, I was born the same year that Rosa Parks actually sat on the bus, And so, just going through that period of time, and then, a lot of things affect me, the politics, the music, if something's happening in the news, like Black Lives Matter or whatever, I kind of like to respond to that, and I always kind of think of artists as being the actual documenters of our time, a lot of times, if someone is a historian, they're sort of looking back at what's going on as far as the written material or the editorials and things. But a lot of times people want to see what the artists were thinking about what was going on during that time. And so, I think the artists are going to be the persons who's going to be pretty genuine and pretty honest about, how people feel about, what's going on these days. And so I try to be very honest with my artwork about my experience, as a Black man, and as an American, and as a person in the community.
Wonderful. So we're very nearly at time, but I want to give you a moment. What's next? What are you working on? What are you really excited about?
Right now, I'm starting to. I just retired, and so I have a new studio, and so right now I'm starting to just move some things around. I want to actually work on some more of those mixed media frames, and kind of create some of those. I've working on some other projects, some printmaking projects, trying to develop some larger scale drawings with that rubbing effect. And so I actually bought a bigger, when I work on those, I work on a light table so I can actually kind of see what's going on with the layers and things. And so I actually just developed another light box that's a lot bigger that I can actually work on the larger print for those. So that's going on, and who knows what else.
All right. Well, I can't wait to see it. So I'll be keeping my eyes peeled for that. I want to thank you again so much, Larry, for this great artist talk. Really enjoyed watching the trajectory of your artwork and also being such a fan for such a long time. Thank you all for joining us for this talk by Larry Winston Collins as a part of our programming for the Black Life as Subject Matter exhibition here at the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery. I'd like to give A special thank you to curator Willis Bing Davis for putting together such a great exhibition, to the participating artists, as well as to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the OAC, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.